Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and we're going to get started with this webinar. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to share with you today, so this should be a lot of fun. Just let me know if for some reason you are not able to hear the sound. Welcome to my first Counterpoint webinar. Today I really want to talk about two things. I want to talk about what I feel is an appropriate sequence for those who want to develop these musicianship skills, like what courses should you take, what things should you study. And then the second thing I want to do is expand upon that Counterpoint teaser trailer that I posted, where I showed you the Haydn piece and I showed you where it started and where it went to. And I want to talk about how Counterpoint can actually help you create music like that. Now, Counterpoint has a lot of different uses. This is just one of the many uses. So we're going to talk in a little more detail about that. So Haydn really builds his piece on just two chords. There's only two chords here. You can see in the first couple measures, right here, and the pickup, it's just an F major chord, just a tonic triad in the key of F major. And then we go to a dominant chord. This is a dominant seventh chord. Now, it's not resolving correctly because this B flat here is a seventh and it should come down. But we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But essentially, this is the framework for his first 8 measures. Just two chords. And a lot of people think we need all these different chords, we need all this variety in our music. What you need is selective variety. You need to create clarity in your composition, and you also need to insert something a little bit unexpected. But that doesn't always mean you have to have a new chord for every measure. So we're going to talk about how he actually did this. But let's go ahead and just listen to this chord progression. You're going to notice it sounds just a little bit archaic. So one of the things I'm going to draw your attention to is this third measure. We don't count the pickup. So this is a third measure. You have this chord here. Within that chord is actually a diminished fifth between the third of the chord, that E, and the B flat. And so the way this is resolving is a little bit non-standard. It goes up. And it doesn't quite sound right. The correct resolution would come down. So he's not doing that in this particular chord progression because he didn't write this, I did. But this is a very basic framework for chords that could be used to create a larger composition. So let's see how this relates to Counterpoint a little bit. This is what we're going to be talking about today. How does he go from that to this? You'll see the chord progression still there. It's the same chord progression. It's just 1 and 5 chords throughout. But let's listen to this, and you'll see how much contour and dynamic variety and rhythmic variety, and how there's this motive that keeps coming back right here in the first measure, those 16th notes. So that makes it very identifiable, and it really helps push the piece forward. So let's go ahead and listen to the final product, and then we'll talk about how he does this. Now, Haydn does some things that are not considered great in a melody. One of the things that we're going to touch upon is this high C. It repeats. Generally in a melody you want to have one high point because otherwise it kind of feels like you're banging your head against the ceiling. So why is Haydn doing this? Very simply, one reason he's doing it is he's viewing this all as a prolongation to this C here. He's creating tension, and he gives you that first C over a 1 chord instead of the 5 chord. So this C serves as a linking unit between the 1 chord, he took the C from here and put it up here, and the 5 chord, which is the root of the chord. It's a common tone between 1 and 5. So he's able to get away with having this kind of high note which rings in our ears, and then he's able to resume it here. You could almost view this as you've got this complete measure here, and then it just ends here. So you could kind of hear this in multiple different ways. Listen to it one more time and see if you can kind of hear how this C is just prolonged. we really want right here, we want this C to come back, but we don't get it. We don't get it until here. So that's another way that hiding creates tension that's unresolved. Listen one more time and listen to how this B flat with the suspension that comes down really helps to create this false sense of resolution. We expect to come back to that C. We expect a resolution. Instead, we get this dissonant chord right here, because the G and the B flat, that is definitely dissonant with the F and the C, but it resolves down to the F and the A, the one chord here. So you wouldn't identify this as some sort of G chord, G, B flat, D, F, A, C. It's not an 11th or a 13th chord. It's nothing like that. This is just a suspension, and he's using that to create more tension. So let's listen to it one more time and listen for that suspension. I have to actually let the recording rewind, which is kind of funny. Okay, here we go. Did you hear that? All right, so we're going to talk more about how he actually did all this, how he built this entire melody off one chord progression, and how Species Counterpoint is sort of the material that he used to learn how to do this. It's not like he necessarily sat down and said, okay, I'm going to open up my Fuchs textbook and I'm going to use the laws of counterpoint. Because one, they're not laws, they're guidelines, and two, they're just a teaching tool. Those rules of counterpoint are not there to be taken as doctrine. They're best practices to create a composition that sounds smooth and balanced. So, how do you get to this point as a musician where you understand everything, right? You can never do that. You'll never reach a point where you know everything. I'm still learning. I'll be learning the rest of my life. But what I'm attempting to do here, and I just want to kind of show you kind of a roadmap that you could use as a musician, I'm creating a series of courses, which may not seem that they link together, but they do link together in the end. And the way this works is the very first thing, if you don't know how to read or write music, you would start with this series of Staff Speaks. So if you don't want to get that, you don't have to. What you need to do, though, is you need to learn the names of the notes on the treble, the bass clef staff. That's really what this book focuses on. But it does something for advanced users too, because I realize that some advanced users aren't going to need to learn the notes on the treble and the bass clef. So what I've done is I've turned it into my opening up the ear book. So it's a series that, even though you're starting at the beginning and there's some information about note names, there's also a lot of really complex information, something known as inharmonicity. It's not enharmonics, we've probably all heard that term. It's IN, and it refers to how music's actually heard, different from what you hear on a notation program. And there's a lot of stuff about the overtone series and the nature of the staff system. But what it does is it helps you get deeply inside notes, and it helps to open up your ear from the ground up. And the Staff Speaks can be taken alongside Flawless Ear Training, my ear training course. So the way you could do this without getting these courses, there's a lot of free materials and free resources. You can totally do that. What you want to do is learn the names of the notes on the treble and bass clef staff, really listen to them in the right way, just try and hear their characteristic sounds, and then take an ear training program that really develops your ear. You do those things at the same time when you're starting to build a good foundation. From there, you get about halfway through the Flawless course, or you finish Unit 1. I usually recommend wait till at least session 13 in the Flawless course. Then you can start working more on audiation, because the Flawless course starts the process of audiation. Audiation refines it. It gets it to a point where you can actually use it in composition. The next thing that you would do actually is a continuation of audiation, and that's what we're talking about today. It's counterpoint. You want to learn to write in 2, 3, and 4 parts. But when you write in counterpoint, you don't want to just learn the rules. You want to do it the way we did it back in the day. You know, the traditional way of learning counterpoint was to develop the ear. It was an exercise in intense ear training and audiation. So you always want to start, when I teach a course, I start by teaching you how to develop a melody. And you're always audiating these melodies. Then we add a second line. and you're audiating the 2 lines. And you've learned how to do this from the audiation course. And then you do 3 lines and 4 lines. So what Counterpoint does is it teaches you to write music intuitively using basic voice leading principles and music that will sound good. And then once you reach the end of that course, I show you how it can apply to more modern music and chords that are not so 16th century. So then from there, what happens is you'll notice there's no music theory in here. The Staff Speaks covers music theory. So if you're following along with that series, the theory will catch up with you. But if you go from Counterpoint on to Form and Analysis, my Form for Composers course, what happens is you first learn 8 different types of themes. There's 8 standard themes that every musician should at least be aware of. And what's really cool about this is I have you writing these themes and practicing writing all these different themes. And then I show you how different themes are appropriate for different forms. And I teach you how to write binary, ternary, sonata, slow movement form, minuet trio forms, concertos, and even a symphony. So you're creating a composition in each one of these forms. And this can be viewed as kind of like the capstone. This is the end. And what I do in Form for Composers is I teach the theory necessary as you need it. So as long as you've been following along through the ear training aspect of it, then the contrapuntal aspect of it, you have established a foundation to allow you to do form and analysis, and it's just a very natural and easy progression. And you don't have to, scratch your head in a theory course thinking, okay, this is moving too fast, because I'm actually giving you the fundamentals. I'm going to rant for just about 30 seconds. One of the things that I noticed in my university music teaching experience is that students would come in and they'd be brilliant musicians, but they'd lack some fundamental understanding that could have been taught had a sequence been applied in the proper way. And so if we get the ear training up to par, that could be year 1. Year 2, we could move on to audiation and counterpoint. Year 3, we could do form and analysis. And typically all these courses take 3 years anyway, but we divide them up into individual semesters and things get lost along the way. And so people get into form and analysis and they don't know theory. And there's no time to teach theory, and they don't even have the basic skills to kind of write compositions. So Counterpoint and all these other courses solve that. So this is something that, you can do on your own. There's a lot of really good books out there, like the Kaplan Analyzing Classical Form is a really good book for form and analysis. For Counterpoint, I'd recommend the Fuchs book as a reference, but then my favorite book is Counterpoint and Composition by Salzer. And then for the ear training theory and audiation, that's stuff that you can just find a playlist that you like if you don't want to go around with this sequence. I mean, my sequence is obviously very integrated and it plans for the next step, but you don't have to follow along with it. So that's enough about that. Let's get back to the Haydn piece. So we started with a simple chord progression right here. This chord progression that you see in front of you, as we've kind of briefly talked about, we're going to find a way to turn it into this. And we're going to use some basic contrapuntal principles. But Haydn also used some other techniques, some kind of secret techniques, these inner threads that hold a piece together. I've kind of already talked about that a little bit. But here we have this C on the top, right? It serves as a prolongation. If this C went up to a D, it wouldn't really be so much of a prolongation because it wouldn't be as shocking. It would be expected. We'd expect this C coming so early in the piece to not be the high point, because most high points in melodies come between about halfway and 3/4 of the way through. So when we hear this, we're surprised again because we expect to have a higher note. We expect Haydn to make a nice melodic arch, but he doesn't. What he does instead is he gives you a suspension, a dissonance right here, and then he resolves it down. He doesn't even use a retardation where it goes up. And then here we're like, okay, we're finally going to get it, but no, we don't. We get the C again. And then it closes off the piece. So what Haydn's done is he's created a lot of tension, which pushes this first phrase forward and creates an expectation for the second phrase. And the expectation is that at some point this piece has to expand. And he does it all based on a very simple chord progression. So you can see we've got measure 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That B flat right there, it's put in the highest voice. So he's transferring this to the highest voice. The E, which is the quality of the chord, is right here on the downbeat. The fifth of the chord is right here. Now we know it's a 5 chord because we have the root of the 5 chord right here, and it's very strong. That's the lowest note in the 5 chord, so it makes it sound like a dominant, like this. If we play this 5/7, it makes it sound like it wants to come home. And when we come back to the 1 chord, that's a 1 chord, it sounds complete. It sounds like we've fulfilled its mission. So he's creating all these different things that create tension, but he started with a simple chord progression. So you could literally sit on the piano and come up with 1 chord per measure. They could even be the same in each measure, and that could be the foundation for your composition if the structure is sound. And this is a sound structure because this is half a phrase right up until here. The first 4 measures, 1, 2, 3, 4, ends right here really. And then the second phrase uses the same pickup from the beginning, and it creates a second part of the phrase. Now this is actually all one phrase. We would actually call it a parallel period. But what's happening here is he's just using a simple chord progression to push that phrase forward. So he had the structure first. So that's the first thing you want to do. You want to create a chord progression that works. So now we move on to first species. So in first species, what you have is a note against note relationship. Notice how in every measure, including this one, these are all one-to-one relationships. So these are actually first species examples. This is a first species counterpoint. It's not great, but it does have a single high point, and then it does have a nice contour. It has some skips in it, and it has a leap at the end, which is not great. We prefer something else like a G coming down to the F. But we're trying to keep it somewhat similar to the structure of this piece. So we have the B flat here. I didn't want to go all the way up to a C here because I would have repeated the C, so I wanted to have a single high point. So we're going to listen to this, and you can kind of hear the framework for Haydn's piece. Now that sounds a little bit more melodic than his. It actually feels like it has more of a contour because the C is slowly coming down. One of the things he gets in the way is this B flat here. Notice how that B flat felt a little bit out of place? Let's listen again. We want to hear bum, bum, bum. That's what we want, but instead we get. It's more melodic, but it doesn't give us that nice cadential resolution. And this is one of those things that you'll find in music. Often what happens is, especially in tonal music, is you either have an arpeggiation up to a high point, which is usually scale degree 1, 3, or 5, or you have a linear progression, so stepwise motion up to the high point. So something like this. If C is your high point, you might have something like this, an arpeggiation. And that is your high point. Another way to do this is to have kind of a linear progression that moves in steps. That's another way that composers often reach kind of this high point of the piece. And if you look at a lot of classical and romantic period music, you will find this high point exists, and it comes back over and over again. And it's typically scale degree 3, somewhere in the beginning of the piece, and then towards the end you get scale degree 2 and 1. So if I put my A here as a high point, that'd be scale degree 3. We'd say it prolonged all the way to here, and then it came down to scale degree 2, which could be a G, and 1. So this B flat feels out of place because it's not resolving to 1 properly. Listen to it one more time, and listen especially to how that B flat sounds. It just sounds off, right? But one of the issues here is if we go down to a G here, then we end up having 2 3s in a row, but that actually ends up not being an issue. Once you learn the rules of counterpoint, you start to understand, oh, I can use 3 or 4 of the same interval in a row. Why not more than 4? Because at that point you start to create monotony. You want to keep the motion moving. You want to make it sound like the two lines are independent. If they start following each other in parallel motion, they're both going in the same direction all the time, then we lose some of that independence. So this would be an example of how you could take Haydn's piece and turn it into first species. So now let's look at how we can do this and turn it into second species. So second species is where you have 2 notes to every 1 note. And there's something to be learned from each species, which is what I kind of talk about when I teach counterpoint, and Salzer talks about it a little bit too, so it's a good book to get. So in second species, what happens is you'll notice there are 2 notes, 2 quarter notes, for every 1 note in the bass. So we could actually view this kind of as a little bit of a canus firmus. And here we have 2 notes for every note of what I would call the canus firmus. Now this isn't the greatest canus firmus in the world, because we really should have a B here, or sorry, a G coming down to an F. I thought it was a bass clef, but it still serves as a background. And this is where counterpoint, you release some of the dogma when you're actually composing. Do you always need a contrapuntal cadence? No. You can use other types of cadences. So here we have an E coming up to the F, and you end up with E, G, and B flat, which is a leading tone chord, the 7th scale degree of F. F, G, A, B, C, D, E. E is scale degree 7. And that is a dominant substitute. So what this chord here does is it creates this feeling like we need to go on. And it happens because in the first species example, in order to have more stepwise motion, the C was removed in the bass. It used to be a 5/7 chord. So what we see here is the Haydn piece being reduced to second species. So let's listen to it and talk a little bit more about it. So you can start to hear more of the melody from the original Haydn piece now. Dun, da, 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 dun. We're starting to hear it now. It's coming through a little more clearly. Sorry, it's a little bit high for my voice. But you can see where the structure is coming from. So you could start a piece with a foundation that is based on first species. And then from first species, you can expand it to second. This is theoretically a way that you could do this, but that's not really how counterpoint works. We don't sit there and say, here's my skeleton, now here's my second species, okay, now I'm going to do third, fourth, and then make it fifth species. It doesn't really work like that, because first species rarely translates well into second, and second rarely translates well into third, as we're going to see. You can see that I'm trying to keep the F and the C, I'm trying to keep the same basic structure from first species. See this? F. Let me get my cursor out. So here's the F, here's the C. I moved the B flat, right? Here's the A, here's the F, A, B flat, and F. So I'm trying to keep the structure from the original Haydn example. But what that does is now I have a lot of skipping around. Lots of skips. Here's some nice stepwise motion, another skip. So it's almost too many skips, and that's what happens when you write a second species solution based on the first one, first species. So if you wanted to do this as an exercise, it's actually really challenging. Write a really nice first species counterpoint solution and then try and turn it into second species. You'll see how difficult it is. But what this teaches us is that we can look at Haydn's piece from a first species level, and then we can also take it apart and kind of look at it from a second species level. And what we'd want to do is have a reference sheet. We want to always refer this back to the original composition. But what we're doing for the purpose of this lecture is a little bit simpler. We're just comparing second species to the first species example. When you do an analysis, you can often have multiple layers. I would consider this kind of like a 2-layer analysis. If we had the entire piece, the actual written music, we call that the surface level. And we could always go back and forth now. We could look at the surface level, we could go down to this level, go back to the surface level, go down to first species, surface level, second. You go back and forth to find out what's going on in the piece. You don't just analyze the chords. Analyzing the chords is like step one. And honestly, the chords don't matter all that much. The variety of chords matter, but the actual chords used rarely have the most interesting details to be revealed in a composition. So let's see what happens when we take our second species and try and turn it into third species. So now what we do is we take our second species and we try and make it into third species. So here, if we look at this, the structure kind of stays the same. F, A, C, A, G, B flat, A, G. It's all staying in the same location. F. This is different. The G was pushed over one, and now we have a dissonance here in relation to the original. Here is a consonance and a consonance. This is actually kind of a voice exchange where the A switches and the C switches. We call that a voice exchange. Here's another voice exchange. The G switches and the B flat switches. So what we see here is there are all these dissonances on the offbeats, and most of these are all passing tones. So passing tones are very common. It's what happens when you have a consonant pitch and another consonant pitch, and in the middle you get a dissonance. So one of the things that we've changed here, if we looked at the foreground, the original composition was F, C, F, C, and then it goes A, F, A, F. But what we're doing here is we're changing it. We're going F, G, A, B flat. Now we're doing that because we are trying to write a third species solution. Anytime that you have a skip or a leap in music, what does it do? It brings attention to whatever's happening on the other side of that skip or leap. So if I go like this, that's a leap. It emphasizes that C. Let me show you another example. If I just walk up the scale like this, as soon as you heard that G, that skip, that G was accented, the fourth note was accented. It brings it out. If I just go stepwise, it's much smoother. So our ear naturally tries to fill in skips and leaps with steps. That's the premise behind a lot of music. And what's happening here is, even though Haydn goes from A, F, A, F, what we're really hearing is dissonance here when we go to the C. So if I do this, you can hear the dissonance. Now if I did something like this, it's more boring because everything's stepwise. So Haydn's creating a greater impact by putting in that skip and not giving us the B flat stepwise motion. If he did the B flat, it would be more it would be a smoother progression, but there'd be less tension. And so you can see how it's actually a little bit difficult to go from second species to third species. So again, we don't do this in composition, but we can analyze a composition on multiple different levels. After we've written it, we've used an intuitive process, came up with a nice chord progression and a melody, we can start to think in terms of species counterpoint to make our piece more interesting. And so right now, this is a good example of third species, even though it has only one high point. It should have, it has two high points, it should only have one. So that's not great, but otherwise this is a good example of third species. It has a lot of passing motion, it has a lot of dissonance. Usually passing motion occurs on the offbeats. In this case, passing motion occurs on the offbeats, and that may be one reason why this G got moved back to here, because it's now a dissonance and we don't want it in a heavily accented location if possible. So these rules of counterpoint, again, they're just guidelines, they're procedures, they're best practices, but you can break them when you need to. So let's go on to fourth species. This species accomplishes one thing very important for the Haydn piece. So fourth species is really a species of suspensions, and you can have a variety of suspensions. Now this one here, the A going up to the B flat, that's actually a retardation, and you wouldn't actually see that in counterpoint. because in order to have retardation, that can only occur in the bass typically, and we don't usually use retardations, we use suspensions. So right here, it starts out consonant, goes into a dissonance, and then it resolves up. Typically a suspension, always a suspension, has to resolve down. So this is an example of kind of a compositional technique, because what did we have here? This A was kind of being prolonged. So we kept that in order to prepare this B flat, which is now a consonance. This here is actually a fourth, a perfect fourth. They consider that a dissonance, and it resolves down to a third. So from here to here, this actually works really well as a four species solution. This part right here, though, does not work. And so there's problems, because we want to try and include suspensions in as many measures as we can. But if we're taking our third species solution and trying to turn it into a solution of suspensions, what do? We could have the C, but it has to change here, because in fourth species, you have two notes for every one note of the counterpoint, but it tends to be offset, right? So we have a problem. If I try and use the C, I'd have to come down to a B flat here, and now that's a fourth. If I try and use a B flat, I'd come down to the A. It'd be the same situation we're in here. If I use the F, we could hold that over. That'd be consonant. And then we could come down to the E here, and then a D here, but then we miss our high B flat. So we changed the structure too much. So what was put in here was a retardation, just to try and keep the feeling of suspensions in. And this is something that you can do on composition. It wouldn't be allowed in four species, but you understand the principle of suspensions now. It's to create tension and resolution. And in this particular case, this might be a good resolution. So let's listen to it and see if you hear that second measure, if it sounds awkward to you. So that's what suspensions do to a composition. They create this constant dissonant energy that pushes a piece forward. Listen one more time. So what Haydn could have done, I mean, he didn't do this, but what he could have done is he could have had a first species, second species, third species, fourth species version of his composition. And he could see kind of how it works on multiple different levels. And then he can go through and fine-tune the final product based on these basically four graphs: first, second, third, and fourth. And he can see problems that occur. Like this actually became a problem where we had the A held over. But does it sound good to the ear? Is there a way that you can justify it? Yeah, you can justify it because it's part of a chord, F, A, C. And then here, this A is going up to a B flat here, but we're going to have more voices. So potentially, you could have another voice on top, and this A could still resolve down, because you could make this work, where the A resolves down to a G, and then you'd have a nice suspension that actually works. The types of suspensions you could typically use were a 4-3. So that means you have a fourth above the bass, so this F to the B flat, it's a compound fourth, we'd call it an 11th, but you can use that. That's 4 going to 3. You can also have a 7 going to a 6. So here's another issue, because this is actually a 7, you couldn't do that. You'd want to make sure that this was on a consonant beat. But again, if we're trying to follow the original composition, we see that we have a suspension that doesn't work here. So what I'm getting at here is when we take our third species solution and we also take the foreground and we see what Haydn wrote as a melody, we can start to see some issues like this. This is not a valid suspension that you would want to go through and check, and you use your ear and you say, well, does a voice leading work? Or is this something that maybe I should change? Is this a weakness in the composition? So species is kind of what you can use after you've written a composition to evaluate the effectiveness of your composition. And then you make a choice. You can say, well, it violates these rules of counterpoint, but I don't care because this is what I want to write and I like the way it sounds. But you know that you did that on purpose. Or you can say, actually, this is awkward. This seventh here and this retardation that we have here, those are problems. I'm going to change them. So it makes you a better editor. It allows you to write music that's more perfect in a way. And it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to have the perfect composition, but you can get closer when you understand counterpoint. And the other thing is, you're studying counterpoint, you're audiating everything all the time. And so you'll get really good at audiating balanced lines, which are easier to audiate than dissonant lines. So now fifth species. So what we have here is, this would be an example of a fifth species solution. So we removed a lot of the problem areas. All those suspensions that didn't work, got rid of them because they weren't true suspensions. Here we have a skip and an F major triad. So we have two skips, perfectly fine contrapuntally. Here we go from second species to second species here, and then third species here. And so you can see how now all the different species are being used. And this is now following more in line with the original composition, with the original surface level music, the music that we see. And you can see how we went from second to third to now fifth species. We only kept one suspension, and Haydn did too, because I'm taking this straight from his music. So fifth species is where you combine everything to write compositions. But is that how you write? No. I believe that you first get a sense for melody by listening to other music, by writing a lot of melodies, by hearing them performed, and then you get better at understanding, okay, that works, this doesn't work, right? And then once that happens, then you can kind of use this knowledge to edit your compositions. So we're going to go ahead and listen to what this sounds like, so you can hear how Haydn's piece is starting to come through now. So now you can really hear, we're going to play this again, how this C, it stands out. There's not enough music in between. There's not enough notes. There's not enough material going on. And so we really hear that C stand out, and it doesn't sound as good as in the actual composition. Listen one more time and pay special attention to that C. And you'll notice here at the end, we fixed it. We fixed that it was going up to a B flat, we brought it back down to the G. So this C is being prolonged, but it's too obvious here. It's too obvious that we have the same high point twice. So what does Haydn do? He ornaments it. So he creates motives. And he has this fourth motive and a third motive. Here he brings it back again. This is a parallel period because of that. So here's the fourth and the third. In the classical period, there actually is no such thing as a parallel period. There's only a period, and the only period that actually exists in the classical period is the parallel period. And I know that's confusing. We talk about this in my form class, but a newer way of viewing the period is that the only one that actually exists is parallel. If you have a contrasting or modulating period, those are now categorized as hybrid themes, because what they're using is different components from what we call a period, one type of phrase, and a sentence, another type of phrase. So these two types of phrases, they borrow different components from each other, and then they create these four hybrid themes. So that's 6 of your themes. You got the 4 hybrids, the period, and the sentence. There's actually 2 more types of themes that we really get into in the form analysis course. But what we have here is this motive, this third motive. And so these 16th notes now create a motivic, rhythmic motor that pushes the composition forward. You'll see it here. You can hear that da 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 da. You hear this rhythm coming back over and over again. It's a rhythmic motive in the piece, and he uses it to expand upon the species solution, the 5th species solution. This is where we're ornamenting it. Here's the B flat, here's the A. Just using stepwise motion, we come into the G. So everything here lines up pretty well with what he's trying to do. And this is actually your cadence, because that was a suspension. Dissonance, this is actually the chord tone, A and F, for your F major chord. And then he continues. The A's line up, the C's, B flat, A. So in a very creative way, he ornaments his fifth species solution. He thinks about the motives now. Because in counterpoint, there are no motives. In counterpoint, we don't want motives. We want a structure. We want a sound structure. And so what Haydn could now do is he could say, okay, now I need to focus on the bass line. I've got this melody up here. It's da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So what does that sound like? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What could support that? You don't want to have the bass going ga-ga-ga-ga-ga-ga-ga, because it's going to be low. It's not going to be clear enough. We want it to be clear. So what Haydn does is use these eighth note figures. Bum, bum, bum. So let's go ahead and look at his bass line. Okay, so here's his bass line. He gives a solid one chord. Bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. So when he wants clarity, he uses quarter notes. When he wants rhythmic motion, he uses eighth notes. And notice when he uses them. Here, when all this 16th note motion is going, he just pounds out a one chord and then lets the melody do its thing, so it can come out in this F major chord, this third really, resonates. And then we have kind of a C pedal and an F pedal, and an F pedal and an A pedal. So we're sustaining all the notes of the chord. Here, when this note rests, the bass moves, because that's when you need to keep the motion going. You want to keep that forward motion. So here we have da 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 dum, right? And we have bump 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 bump. And that allows the piece to have this continuous momentum. Here on the dissonance, he creates even more dissonance rhythmically by having the F and the C. Now this is actually kind of interesting, because the F down here would be considered a lower neighbor to the G. The C down here is an upper neighbor. So he effectively is using something that you'll learn about, kind of called a double neighbor. But he's doing it in an arpeggiated fashion. And so there's a lot going into this piece. But what he's done here is he's created a texture to accompany the counterpoint. And this is all based on really principles of first, second, third, fourth, fifth species. But what happens is composers, they study this, they learn it, it becomes ingrained. If you audiate it, it becomes a natural part of your process, and you naturally start thinking more contrapuntally. All these chords were formed from a counterpoint solution. So let's go ahead and listen to this so you can hear how we finally arrived at this. And that's it. That's how you take the species and apply it. It's just one of the many techniques you can learn from Counterpoint. So if you want to learn more, go to UreMusic.com. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to open it up for any questions and answers. And if there are a lot of questions, what I may do is just record another video based on the questions, and we'll answer them that way. Otherwise, thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. I hope this is useful to you, and I hope this motivates you to go out, study, and write more music.